In the year 1506, when Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi was born, the winds off the Gulf of Aden carried more than the smell of salt. They carried unease, whispers of raids and counter-raids, the clash of two worlds colliding. Adal's crescent against Ethiopia's cross. Zaila or Salak, his birthplace, was not quiet town. It was a port where caravans met the sea, where the muezzin's call to prayer blended with the shouts of merchants and the creak of ships. Behind that life of trade and prayer stood the shadow of war, for the name of Mahfuz, Adal's great war leader, echoed like a drumbeat across the land. For a child like Ahmed, the rhythm of life was double-edged, mosque and marketplace, Quran and sword. At dawn, he sat among other children on mats, bent over wooden tablets brushed with fresh ink, their young voices weaving the sacred verses into the air. A teacher's stern gaze watched them, every mistake corrected, every syllable sharpened. Ahmed's memory was quick, his voice steady. To those who saw him, he was more than a boy repeating lines. He was a vessel being filled, his heart shaped by the very words that would one day guide his hand in battle. And yet, outside the madrasa, another kind of schooling waited. In Salak, a boy could not grow without seeing men prepare for war. Horses stamped in the dust, blades caught the sun, and riders prayed before setting off on raids against the highlands. Ahmed watched them, the smell of sweat and steel thick in the air. His own hands, small but eager, learned to grip wood and metal, to balance weight, to feel the discipline of a fighter. It was his left hand that found its strength, the hand that would earn him the name Gran, the left-handed. Still, he was not only a child of war. On quiet evenings, the sea spoke too, its waves rolling against the shore, as if reminding the people of Salak that the world was larger than their struggles. Ahmed must have wondered whether he would become a scholar in Harar, carrying books and wisdom, or a warrior like Mahfuz, carrying a sword and scars. He did not know that Allah had already chosen both paths for him. His soul was being tempered like iron in fire, one half sharpened by Quran, the other by steel. The wooden boats of the Red Sea, on the shores of Salak, the wooden sailing boats rocked with the tide, their tall triangular sails pulling tight in the wind, their hulls creaking like old bones. These boats had been the lifeline of East Africa for centuries. They carried spices, cloth, and incense to Arabia, and returned with dates, books, and pilgrims fresh from Mecca. To the people of Salak, the boats were more than wood and canvas. They were threads that tied them to the world. But each time a boat left the harbor, it carried not only goods, it carried sons. Young men with strong arms and restless eyes would step aboard, waving back at mothers who stood on the shore, their hands raised in prayer. The sea was wide, and news was slow. Sometimes the men returned with stories and wealth. Other times, the horizon swallowed them whole. For the mothers, each sail was both pride and grief. They prayed with trembling lips, "O Allah, bring our children back." Some would spend evenings staring at the dark water, imagining the crests of waves like shrouds. Others filled the mosques with whispered supplications, their tears staining the mats as they begged for protection. To live by the sea was to live with a heart that never fully rested. The young Ahmed saw this. He saw the mothers holding back tears, the fathers speaking bravely but watching the horizon with heavy silence. He saw that life was not only prayer and trade, but also risk and loss. From the wooden boats, he learned early that to send out what you love is to trust Allah for its return. It shaped how he viewed the world, The Quran he memorized was not only words, it became a shield for the unseen dangers, like the sea. The sword he practiced with was not only for fighting, but for protecting what was precious, like a mother's hope. And as the sails rose and disappeared into the distance, Ahmed's young soul understood something that would never leave him. Life is a journey where every step, every sail, every breath must be anchored in Allah, for without Him, nothing returns. Fire on the Coast, A Champion Falls, 1517. The year 1517 carved scars into Adal's memory. A Portuguese fleet, sails swollen like dark wings, swept down the Red Sea. They had failed to capture Jeddah, but on their way back, they turned south. When they reached Zila, they set the city ablaze. Flames clawed at the sky, swallowing mosques, homes, and markets. The air filled with the cries of families running from their homes, clutching children and Quran tablets, as if to protect what little they could. Smoke painted the horizon, and the once busy port lay in ruins. For the people of Salak, it was not just a city that burned, it was trust in safety itself. Women wept for sons caught on the docks, elders coughed in the smoke, children clung to their mothers' hands, asking questions no one could answer. Every family felt it. The sea that had once carried life and trade had now carried death into their doorsteps. And in the very same season, another blow fell. Emir Mahfouz, Adal's great war leader, the man every boy had grown up hearing about, was slain in battle against the Ethiopian emperor Lebna Dengel. Mahfouz's name had been a shield to the people, a reminder that there was always someone riding at the frontier, holding back the enemy. Now, word spread that he was gone, his sword silenced, his saddle empty. For young Ahmed, this was no ordinary year. He breathed in the smoke of Salak ruins, and he listened as elders spoke in grief about Mahfouz. In a single season, he saw 2 pillars fall, the port that connected them to the outside world, and the champion who defended their land. He must have felt the earth shift beneath his feet, as if Allah was showing him that nothing in this world lasts except faith itself. Mothers comforted their children, fathers clenched their jaws, and in every household the same questions lingered. Who will protect us now? Who will stand when the world is burning? For Ahmed, the answer had not yet come. But in his heart, he carried both Quran and sword, and he knew one day he would be called to stand where others had fallen. The cracks within, after 1517. When Mahfouz fell, it wasn't only a warrior that was lost, it was the thread that held the frontier together. His death left a silence in Adal that quickly filled with the sound of arguing voices. In Harar and Hubat, where the heart of the Sultanate beat, leaders began to quarrel over power. Governors, emirs, and clan chiefs fought with words and sometimes with blades, each one claiming to be the rightful guardian of the land. For ordinary families, this was the most bitter wound. The Portuguese had burned Salak, the Ethiopians pressed harder from the highlands, and instead of uniting, their own leaders were tearing each other apart. Fathers muttered in anger at night. Why do they fight each other while the enemy sharpens his sword? Mothers pulled their children close, praying not only for protection from outsiders, but also from the chaos within. Young Ahmed, growing up in this storm, would have seen it all. He heard the disputes in the streets, saw the tension in the markets, and felt the weight of division pressing on his people. The Quran verses he had memorized about unity and patience now stood against the reality of leaders blinded by pride. His heart must have burned with frustration. How could a nation survive if its house was divided? And yet, that bitterness was also a teacher. every quarrel he witnessed, every selfish act of a leader grasping for power, carved something deeper into him, a determination not to waste his life in small rivalries. He began to understand that leadership was not about fighting for titles, but about carrying the weight of a people who had no shield. For the families of Adal, these were years of confusion and fear. For Ahmed, they were years of fire and sharpening. Out of the cracks in his homeland, something was being forged in him. The vision of a different kind of leader, one who would not argue over scraps while enemies burned the gates. The Stranger's Hand, 1520s. Not long after Mahfuz's death and the quarrels that tore at Adal's heart, word spread of something even more unsettling. From the highlands came rumors. The Christian emperor of Ethiopia, Lebna Dengel, had opened his gates to strangers from across the sea. They came not as merchants, but as envoys of Portugal, men with pale faces, stiff clothes, and tongues that twisted strangely when they spoke. They had marched with the emperor's court, recording every detail in books, their eyes lingering on the land as if measuring it. To many in Ethiopia, they were saviors, allies who would bring weapons and fire against the Muslims of Adal. To the Muslims, they were a shadow across the horizon, proof that the sea's threat was now marching inland. Among Adal's families, people whispered their fears in low voices. Some worried that these strangers would give Ethiopia more strength to push into Muslim lands. Others shook their heads, wondering why Ethiopia would tie itself to people who did not share their faith or their home. In mosques and markets, the same unease hung in the air. If Ethiopia and Portugal stood together, the balance of the land was turning against them. Ahmed, still young but sharpening into manhood, carried those whispers deep in his heart. He had seen Selak burn. He had felt the loss of Mahfuz. He had watched leaders fight among themselves. And now he saw a storm larger than any before. This was no longer about border raids or clan disputes. This was about faith itself. The Quran verses about patience and jihad, about holding firm against oppression, became more than lessons to him. They became commands that stirred his soul. When Ahmed looked at the world now, he no longer saw only Selak's markets or Harar's streets. He saw something bigger, the clash of civilizations, the struggle of Islam against forces determined to erase it from the Horn of Africa. The boy who once listened quietly in study circles was now becoming a man who knew that one day his voice and his sword would be called upon. The Rise of a Leader, 1520s to 1530s. After the fall of Mahfuz, the Adal Sultanate was a house divided. Leaders in Harar and Hubat argued for power, each man pulling in his own direction, while the Ethiopian Empire pressed harder across the borders. The people felt caught between two storms, the weakness inside their own walls and the danger gathering outside them. In those days, many whispered that Adal's time of strength had ended. But in the middle of that darkness, a young man was rising. Ahmed ibn Ibrahim had grown into his strength, disciplined, sharp, and carrying the memory of both Quran and sword. His reputation spread quietly at first, spoken among fighters who had trained with him and scholars who had tested his mind. The people saw something different in him. He was not chasing titles like the other men. He carried himself as if the weight of the whole nation was already on his shoulders. His marriage to Bati del Wambara, the daughter of Mahfuz, became more than a family union. It was a bridge between past and future. Through her, Ahmed was tied to the memory of the old warrior every boy had admired. Her loyalty and her lineage gave him legitimacy. Her courage gave him strength. Together they became a pair whose names carried both respect and promise. By the early 1530s, Ahmed had taken command of Adal's armies. Men who had once wavered in their loyalties began to rally behind him. Farmers and nomads alike started to see in him the leader they had long prayed for, one who would not waste time on quarrels, one who could unite them when unity was needed most. For Ahmed, this was not ambition, it was duty. The Quran he had memorized as a child echoed verses of patience, justice, and struggle in the path of Allah. The fire he carried from the burning of Seylak, the loss of Mahfuz, the quarrels of leaders, and the arrival of foreigners, now had a direction. He was no longer only a student of faith or a watcher of the world. He was the one stepping into the front lines, chosen by destiny to answer the cries of his people. The sword unsheathed, 1531 onward. By the early 1530s, the waiting was over. Ethiopia had grown bold with Portuguese support, pressing deeper into Muslim lands, burning mosques, and forcing conversions in the highlands. The people of Adal were weary of quarrels among their leaders, and weary of fear. They needed someone to rise, and Ahmed ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi answered that call. In 1531, his armies began their great push into Ethiopian territory. This was not the scattered raiding of the past. It was organized, disciplined, and fueled by a vision that went beyond revenge. Ahmed fought with both Quran and sword in hand, urging his men that this was not simply about land. It was about protecting Islam itself in the Horn of Africa. The battles that followed shook the highlands. Ahmed introduced something the Ethiopians had never faced before: firearms. With the support of the Ottoman Turks, his army carried muskets and cannons, and for the first time in the Horn, the sound of gunpowder thundered across the valleys. Cities fell one after another. For years, the Ethiopian Empire, which had stood for centuries, teetered on the edge of collapse. Ordinary people began to believe again. Families who once whispered in fear now whispered prayers of gratitude, praising the young leader whose left hand carried a sword with unmatched skill. Mothers who had wept at the burning of Seylak now held their children tighter, telling them, "There is a man fighting for us. There is hope." But Ahmed's war was not only fought with steel. He used faith and poetry to bind his men together, reminding them of the Quran, reminding them that their struggle was for Allah alone. His sermons lit fires in weary hearts, and his verses turned into songs that spread across camps and markets, carrying courage where fear once lived. For nearly a decade, Ethiopia bent beneath his campaigns. The empire that had once mocked Adal now fought for its survival. And in those years, the boy of Seylak had fully become the Imam of war and faith, a name carried in both dread and devotion across the Horn. The legendary March, 1531. The year 1531 became the year of fire and thunder. Imam Ahmed gathered his men, Somalis, Harari, Afar, and other Muslims who had long been bruised by Ethiopian raids. They were not only soldiers, they were farmers, herders, and students who carried the Quran in their memory and trust in Allah in their hearts. What made this march different was not only the numbers, but the new strength they carried. Firearms from the Ottomans, muskets, and small cannons that turned the balance of war. The Imam led his men into the highlands, a place thought impossible to conquer. The Ethiopian armies came to meet him, confident in their ancient empire and their emperor Lebna Dengel's crown. But when the battle began, it was not the old sound of spears and swords that echoed first. It was the crack of gunpowder, smoke curling into the sky. The Ethiopians had never faced such weapons before. Their lines broke. At Shimbra and in other clashes that year, the Imam's forces crushed armies many times their size. Whole provinces fell to him. Churches that had been built on the ruins of mosques were toppled, and mosques rose again in their place. The Ethiopian people, once certain their empire was untouchable, fled before the young commander who struck with both discipline and faith. The victories of 1531 turned him into more than a man. To the Muslims of the Horn, he was now a symbol of Allah's promise, that even when enemies grew strong, those who held to faith could overturn empires. Mothers whispered his name to their children as a prayer of courage. Elders recited his battles as proof that Allah had not abandoned them. Even his enemies could not ignore him. To them, he was the left-handed terror, whose march made the ground itself shake. From that year on, the Imam was not only a leader, he was a legend walking, the kind of figure whose name would echo for centuries. The final storm, 1540 to 1543. For nearly a decade, the Imam's march had broken Ethiopia's pride. Provinces that once looked to the emperor now bowed to him. Mosques stood where churches had been, and the Quran was recited in places where it had once been silenced. But the longer the war went on, the more desperate his enemies became. By the early 1540s, Ethiopia had called on its foreign friends for help, the whispers that began years earlier. Of Portugal tying itself to the Ethiopian crown now came to life in steel and gunpowder. A Portuguese force of 400 musketeers, led by Cristóvão da Gama, the son of Vasco da Gama, marched into the highlands to join the emperor's armies. For the first time, the Imam's men faced opponents who also carried muskets and cannons. The balance that had made him unstoppable was slipping. Still, Ahmed did not waver. In battle after battle, he led from the front, his left hand steady on the sword, his voice reminding his men of Allah's promise. At first, he struck victories even against the Portuguese. In one clash, Cristóvão da Gama himself was captured. The Imam ordered his execution, a message that even foreign steel could not erase the will of his people. Yet for all his fire, the empire of Ethiopia, though wounded, refused to collapse. More reinforcements arrived, and the struggle grew heavier. Then, in 1543, at the Battle of Wainadaga, the storm reached its breaking point. The Imam rode as he always had, not behind his men, but at their head. The clash was brutal. Muskets cracked, swords clashed, and the cries of men rose like thunder in the highland air. In the chaos, Ahmed was struck down, the Imam who had marched like fire across the land, the left-handed warrior whose sword had shaken empires, fell in the dust of battle. His death broke the heart of the dervish army. Without his leadership, their unity shattered, and Ethiopia slowly rose again. Families wept, whispering his name in sorrow and pride. To his enemies, it was a victory. To his people, it was a wound that would never fully close. Legacy of Black Excellence. Though his body fell, his name never did. Imam Ahmed Gran's life became a story of courage and resistance. His victories proved that empires could tremble before the faith of the few. His defeats reminded us that even the strongest leaders are still men, guided and tested by Allah's will. His story belongs to more than Somalia. It belongs to the entire Black world. It is part of the history of Black excellence, of people who stood against oppression with faith and fire. For the diaspora scattered across oceans, his name is a reminder. We are one people. And when we stand together, no empire can erase us.